Hi, I'm Peter Lee, and this is Newsbud's China Watch. This week, Trump, globalization, Davos, and crisis. First, if you've been following the furor over Donald Trump possibly being a Russian agent of influence, you've probably asked yourself, what does this have to do with the Westphalian system of international relations? Excellent question. In 1648, after the 30 Years' War had devastated Europe, all the powers, major and minor, there were 194 in all, got together in the Duchy of Westphalia to negotiate a peace. Today, Westphalia is just a state within the German Republic. The role Westphalia played in hosting the treaty negotiations in 1648 is largely forgotten. Instead, Westphalia is renowned for its delicious hams, supplied by acorn-fed pigs, rubbed with a unique salt and herb mixture and carefully cured with the bone in for at least 6 months. First things first, the 1648 treaty was based on two important principles, which have endured as foundations for Western diplomacy to this day. First, it was agreed that the attempt to roll back the Protestant Reformation through military conquest was a mistake. Instead, it was accepted that each state had the right to fix its own religious policies internally. This served as a basis for the principle of non-interference in the internal matters of sovereign states. Second, as a practical matter, it was accepted that the surest path to stability was through a balance of power, a shifting kaleidoscope of alliances, as opposed to absolute hegemony by one power. This Westphalian system, as it's known, has worked pretty well. Henry Kissinger loves the Westphalian system. His classic Westphalian foreign policy move was tilting toward China in order to create a new balance of power with the Soviet Union. Globalism challenges the Westphalian idea that everything will be hunky-dory if sovereign states are allowed to do their own thing as long as they don't mess with other sovereign states. Per globalism, there are global principles and issues that take priority over the traditional sovereign state's right to order its own affairs. Stuff like human rights, transnational terrorism, global warming, nuclear proliferation, international financial stability. President Obama, not much of a Westphalian, very much a globalist, one who built his ideas around the desirability of U.S. hegemony, American exceptionalism as it's called, instead of balance of power. Ditto Hillary Clinton. During the Obama years, countries like Russia and China were regarded as enemies of the principled international order that the United States had committed itself to defining, protecting, and promoting, because Russia and China were flouting vital international norms in pursuit of their narrow national interests. The trouble is, the globalist agenda has proved almost impossible to implement in what's still largely a Westphalian world of jealously sovereign states. The United States' own position as global caretaker is hopelessly compromised by its own opportunistic pursuit of its own national interest. U.S. attempts to channel the spirit of the principled international order, as it selectively interprets it, in places like Libya and Syria have been a disaster. Saudi Arabia and Bahrain have revealed the double standards at the heart of the American promotion of democracy and human rights as universal values. The U.S. therefore appears deficient in the credibility and capacity to completely organize the world according to globalist principles. What about Donald Trump? What's his take on Westphalia? You may have noticed that two of Trump's most outrageous pieces of rhetorical hoo-ha, repudiation of global warming as a hoax and go ahead and enjoy a nuclear war, deny the existence of two key post-Westphalian crises, climate change and nuclear proliferation, that are invoked to justify the globalist orientation. Maybe not an accident. Now, consider Trump's desire to tilt toward Russia. Is Trump a Russian puppet? Could be. But it could also be that he's interested in a balance of power strategy by teaming up with Russia to contain China. Very tough move for a globalist, all in a day's work for a Westphalian. In support of this theory, here's a quote from a story with a foreign policy Republican, Thomas Graham, that appeared on NPR's website on January 18th. It says, "It's not in our strategic interest if the Russian economy is excessively weakened and Russia is driven toward China," said Graham. Here, Graham reflects the thinking of Henry Kissinger, who said during his last visit to Moscow in February that Russia should be perceived as an essential element of any new global equilibrium, not primarily as a threat to the United States. Graham said Kissinger was pointing to the fact that Russia can help balance Chinese power in Central Asia and the Far East. The guy who said that, Thomas Graham, is managing director of Kissinger Associates. He was senior director for Russia at the National Security Council under George W. Bush. He's also in the mix, together with Dana Rohrabacher, as the potential U.S. ambassador to Russia under a Trump administration. What a Trump-Westphalian strategy might entail would be backing off from sanctions over Ukraine as a sticking point in U.S.-Russian relations and basically leaving Europe to its own devices in deterring local Russian adventurism. Before dismissing this piece of realpolitik out of hand, consider that Russia, which is derided by the globalist crowd as a dysfunctional dictatorship that can't make anything and is hopelessly reliant on its dwindling resource base, i.e., a gas station with nukes, has a GNP about that of Italy's, roughly $2 trillion. If the job of deterring Russia and Europe was handed over to Germany, well, Germany has a GDP of $4 trillion, twice as much. And that's even before we bring in the Poles, the Swedes, the Baltic states, let alone the French and the British. And if we're worried about Europe's nuclear shortcomings, well, Germany or Poland might be a happier home for the 60 to 90 nuclear devices NATO now keeps at Incirlik, now that Turkey has become a quasi-ally of Russia in Syria. America and Russia holding hands would drive a policy of Russia, with U.S. support, actively wooing stands like Kazakhstan from close relations with the PRC and turning Central Asia and Siberia into potential venues for U.S. rather than Chinese investment. A lot of attractive sounding scenarios there. Don't have to be a trader to find them interesting. But if you're a globalist who assigns the highest priority to quarantining Russia and China from the principled international order until they behave the right way, you've got a problem. Maybe Trump's just trying to hide his treason behind a Westphalian cape. Or maybe globalists are using treason as a cape to disguise the nature of their opposition to a coherent and achievable Westphalian foreign policy strategy that they object to. As Trump moves away from globalism, the PRC is attempting to assume the mantle of superpower champion of globalism. Xi Jinping, the president of the PRC, went to the World Economic Forum at Davos with the explicit intention of presenting China as the world's best hope for globalism. This was treated with a good amount of derision in the Western financial press, which I tend to share. Currently, the People's Republic of China is struggling to claim recognition as a market economy within the World Trade Organization regime. Maybe China really is an internationalized market economy, and it isn't subsidizing industries and exports directly through preferential loans and indirectly through fiddling with the exchange rate and playing regulatory favorites. Trouble is, Western corporations aren't seeing it that way. Recently, the American Chamber of Commerce in China polled its membership and found that 25%, over 100 corporations, were planning to pull out. That might be a fairly uncrunchable number when it comes to specific circumstances. Is it Chinese or U.S. factors, problems of execution, markets, products, or whatnot? But the key number in the poll for me was that 77% of respondents felt, quote, less welcome, end quote. For comparison, half of respondents felt less welcome the year before. It looks like a bad trend is getting worse. Aside from the issue of openness, China isn't quite the unstoppable engine of global growth anymore. Growth is slowing to 6.4% officially, maybe half that much in reality. As the Chinese economy slows and interest rates are going up, money bags are pulling cash out of the Chinese economy and investing it overseas. The weaknesses of China on the capital account appear most unambiguously in the drop in its foreign exchange holdings, through purchases of RMB to sustain the exchange rate, through outbound foreign direct investment, and via capital flight. Add to that Chinese banks draining their forex reserves to compensate overseas depositors who no longer want to hold a depreciating yuan. And a slowing economy means slowing inbound foreign direct investment to refill the coffers. Thanks to these various factors, the PRC forex reserves have dropped from close to 4 trillion US dollars to close to 3 trillion US dollars. 3 trillion US dollars is being advertised as a key threshold to sustain investor confidence. On January 7th, the People's Bank of China stated PRC forex reserves were 3.01 trillion. Wouldn't be surprised if tightened capital controls, RMB depreciation, or both are in the forecast. And there's a debt pile. The PRC flooded the country with debt to keep the economic and political wheels turning. Now it's rolling over that debt and increasing it instead of retiring it. Now we can add to all that the possibility that the Trump administration may start a trade war with the PRC and put additional pressure on profits of Chinese corporations and on the balance sheets of the banks that are propping them up. George Soros, the leading theoretician and, at least in the case of the Hillary Clinton campaign, financier of the globalist cause, was in Davos to predict the doom of the world now that it had turned away from globalism and to Trump. According to him, PRC debt levels are now at unsustainable levels, maybe 300 to 350% of GDP. Finally, time for that China crash, which George Soros had predicted for last year? Maybe, maybe not. The PRC, I'm thinking, does not only employ US-style macroeconomic tools to manage a crisis of this sort. In the United States, everybody trudges along in denial except Goldman Sachs, until a crisis occurs, and then Goldman Sachs makes a few $billion. In the PRC, by my reading, the Goldman Sachs role is played by the PRC regulators, who strategically inflate and deflate bubbles to try to let punters take some profit and reduce exposure of investors if and when the final crunch comes. If you're into Bitcoin, you know what I mean. The Chinese government, in other words, is trying to get out of its economic fix, not with a few bold public measures, but a multitude of incremental behind-the-scenes moves. Call it life by 1,000 cuts. So that's what Xi Jinping is trying to do in Davos. He's not trying to save the world by slotting China into the globalist leader slot vacated by the United States. He's not even trying to save China, at least not at Davos. He just wants another item in his rescue package. Xi wants to sell the narrative that Europe should have a conscious policy of neutralizing the impact of a Trump-China trade war. At the very least, not piling on together with Trump. Better, if the Europeans oppose a Trump tariff war as an affront to free trade and the health of the global economy. And best, opening up the European demand investment spigot enough to help keep the PRC afloat if and when the Chinese financial crisis becomes more acute. Put Xi Jinping firmly in the Westphalian camp, in other words. Now, a trip down memory lane via the Women's March. The immense Women's Marches, not only in the United States but around the world, reflected frustration that women's political aspirations, symbolized if not exemplified by Hillary Clinton, had been denied in the United States, perhaps unfairly, by under-credentialist, misogynist horror show Donald J. Trump. As far as I can tell, there were no significant matching demonstrations in China. The CCP, looking at the massive crowds of anti-government protesters filling the streets of Washington, D.C. and other cities, is probably patting itself on the back for its foresight in preemptively jumping on Chinese feminists who are trying to work up a social movement inside the PRC in the last couple years. The Chinese feminists were apparently trying to locate and claim safe spaces for social organizing in the PRC, conducting actions keyed on innocuous issues like menstrual leave, more women's toilets, domestic violence, and sexual harassment. However, the CCP decided there would be no safe spaces and harassed the Chinese feminists who had any kind of public profile with judicial and security measures. The Feminist Five, as they were known, despite receiving expressions of concern from the US State Department, the EU, and UN Ambassador Samantha Power, have been effectively quarantined in their home provinces. One of the five, Zheng Churan, did recently receive publicity, at least in the Western press, for calling out Donald Trump's sexism in a letter she sent him in December. The existence of an energized women's political bloc is something that political professionals in the United States are now going to have to devote energy either to blunting or co-opting as their party affiliations and strategies dictate. The PRC has already done that, blunting I mean. Of course, the Chinese government is intensely and proactively suspicious of any social movement, be it political, religious, human rights, labor, or feminist, that has the potential to put feet on the street in enormous numbers. In the area of women's rights, amazingly, the CCP can probably thank Hillary Clinton for alerting it to the threat over 20 years ago. The unity principle for this year's Women's March on Washington, human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights, was extracted from Hillary Clinton's famous address to the 1995 UN Women's Conference, which was held amid great tension and controversy in Beijing. The 1995 speech was a genuine political and social milestone, both for the attendees and Chinese feminists, and a cause of genuine political alarm for the People's Republic of China, which declined to broadcast the speech. The 1995 speech was continually touted during Hillary Clinton's campaign as evidence of her long-standing and pivotal role as a champion of human rights and feminism, and speaking truth to power, and stomping on China. However, as is often the case with the Clintons, there is another side. For one thing, in 1995, the Clinton administration was reeling from devastating defeats in the 1994 midterms. Hillary Clinton's role as an effective administration insider and advocate had been gutted by collapse of her signature health care reform initiative. Political rehabilitation was a priority. Foreign affairs was the path. Second, the Washington consensus was that U.S. sanctions on the PRC for the Tiananmen massacre had run their course, and it was time to get back to business. For President Bill Clinton, who had attacked George H.W. Bush during his presidential campaign for coddling China, some awkward backfilling was required. Most awkward was the renewal of most favored nation duty treatment for the PRC. PRC MFN renewal had been made conditional on certifying China's progress in human rights. In May 1994, President Clinton bit the bullet and explicitly delinked Chinese human rights from trade. The notorious rationalization for this piece of political expediency was that enhanced economic links between China and the United States was a path to China's political liberalization. That particular theory is in the doghouse right now. The Clinton administration remained committed to the principle of advancing human rights, and it needed some political cover from its critics in Congress, both on the Republican and Democratic sides. Hillary Clinton's trip to Beijing offered the prospect of providing a new kind of affirmation of human rights that could exploit the PRC eagerness to burnish its human rights credentials as a member of the international community in good standing by hosting a splashy UN conference on women's rights. As the conference opened, the PRC had already been forced to advertise its subordination of support for women's rights to state interests by blocking visas for diaspora Tibetan groups that hoped to attend the NGO conference, held in parallel with the official state actor conference Clinton was addressing, to get their objections concerning PRC policies in Tibet on record inside China. The government also harassed 9 Tibetan activists who had been able to make it to Beijing on tourist visas and had tried to be heard at the conference. Hillary Clinton handled this situation quite astutely by using the rhetoric of UN-centric universal human rights rather than the human rights policies of the U.S. government. And she used the professed support of human rights to assert a linkage between women's rights and political liberalization in a way the PRC undoubtedly found objectionable. Ironically, since irony is never far from the Clintons either, a few years after this ringing denunciation of the exploitation of women, President Clinton embarked on his dalliance with Monica Lewinsky. From the Chinese point of view, unofficial as well as official, the takeaway from Mrs. Clinton's speech was, even if the U.S. government temporarily modified its China human rights policies for reasons of expediency, criticism and pressure could continue in the name of the superior claims of universal human rights. It was a signal, in other words, that the United States was not accepting the principle that a sovereign state had absolute right to order its internal affairs. And Hillary Clinton's particular framing of the issue alerted the CCP that if feminists were able to get the women's rights nose into the political tent, the whole democracy camel was likely to follow. So, count the massive turnout of the Women's March on Washington as validation of CCP anxieties and a reason why the CCP is relieved at the defeat of Hillary Clinton, even if Donald Trump is promising to build his foreign policy on a foundation of overt hostility to the PRC. Whether Xi Jinping and Donald Trump can achieve a modus vivendi is probably the key question, internationally anyway, of the Trump era. That's all for this week. Thanks for watching. If you're watching this on YouTube, go to newsbud.com, where you'll find exclusive content available only to the Newsbud community. I'm Peter Lee for Newsbud's China Watch.
For just a small subscription fee, you can become a member of the Newsbud community and help keep this website running. Your subscription will provide you with full community access to exclusive content, including videos and articles from Newsbud's team of experts and analysts, as well as a members-only monthly newsletter from Newsbud's founder, Sibel Edmonds. Sign up today for full access at newsbud.com.